All right. Hello. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are incredibly excited to kick off our third author talks session here at the Partnership for Public Service. My name is Emma Shirato-Allman. I'm an associate manager at the partnership on our tech and innovation team, and I have the immense pleasure of welcoming our speakers for today, the authors of The Tech That Comes Next, Afua Bruce and Amy Sample Ward. Before introducing them more fully, a few housekeeping notes. We invite you to use the Zoom chat function to communicate, put your comments and reactions, and the Q&A feature to be able to submit a question for our open portion of the event. And we also have our live poll going on just to get a sense of who's in the room, so please fill that out at your leisure. Now, on to introducing our speakers. First, Afua Bruce, who serves as an executive strategy consultant and advisor, as well as adjunct faculty at Carnegie Mellon's Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. She joins us with experience spanning sectors, having served as the Chief Program Officer for DataKind, Director of Engineering at New America, Data Strategy Lead at the FBI, and Executive Director of the National Science and Technology Council under the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Our second distinguished speaker and author for today, Amy Sample Ward, the Chief Executive Officer at N10, Chair of the Portland Elections Commission, and an advisor and board and steering committee member to multiple digital inclusion initiatives. They have worked in direct service, policy, philanthropy, and capacity building organizations in both formal and informal capacities. And in addition to being an author for The Tech That Comes Next, their other books include Social Change Anytime, Anywhere, co-authored with Allison, and Social by Social. Today, we are talking about The Tech That Comes Next, how changemakers, philanthropists, and technologists can build an equitable world. Released earlier this year, it invites us to ask specific questions and have expansive mindsets to better understand where we are and actively reimagine where we can go. I'll be kicking off our fireside chat with a question about one particular aspect of the book. It has literal illustrations of the current state of systemic exclusion and the future state of systemic inclusion. And so, asked to either of you, what inspired you to depict it this way? And if there are standout examples from either the book or since its publication that you feel exemplify these two states.
And I'm also happy to share my screen so folks who haven't seen them are able to see what we are talking about. So I think I am successfully sharing my screen. Okay, thank you for nodding. So Afua, I'll let you start introducing here.
Absolutely. So we really wanted to have these images created to just really bring home the point about we really want to go from a world where we are today of systemic exclusion to a world of systemic inclusion. And so when we think about where we are today, and Amy and I were having these conversations of what are some of the salient points about how technology is used in the world today? Well, it's all kind of walled off in that people sort of hoard power and information. Decision-making is very centralized. Technology and just the distribution of resources in general is often exclusive. It has, again, centralized control. As you see in the image here, it's walled off, it's gray, there's lots of smog coming out, there's some discarded technology that's there, which I think speaks to really focusing on some of the industries and technology. What this image doesn't have is people. It doesn't have signs of life and growth and things like that, because the tools that are there, the technology that's there, are probably only working for people who are happy in one of these structures that you see here. And so that's where we are today. But then if you think about where we might go in the future, if we're saying we're building an equitable world, that's a world around systemic inclusion. So when you look at this image, right, it's now there's green stuff. It's in color. Things are growing. There's a river, there are resources, there are actual humans, and there are humans of different backgrounds and different types doing different things there. You can see the words there that are really important to an equitable world, to a world of systemic inclusion, about community and justice and shared resources and relationships and accountability and collaboration. And so this is where we would like to go. And so really then thinking about what are the tools that we need to get us there. Some of those tools may be technology tools. They may be designing and using technology in different ways, in more community-centered, human-centered ways. And what are the different actions that we want to prioritize? How do we want to think about sharing information and collaborating? So that talks about where we want to go. Amy, what would you add? I believe you're on mute.
I think the other piece too, I was working so hard to not stop sharing my screen that I never unmuted. You know, I think the only piece I would add is that for us, we really want it to be palpable that there are no people in the previous image, and there are people in this one, and not just people in this one, but people are, you know, the technology here could be a cane. The technology could be a wheelchair. The technology could be a computer, right? That what technology is in service to those people. And I think as we have this conversation today, that's kind of a theme we're going to return to, is that technology isn't creating itself for its own means. I mean, hopefully, like that is many movies storyline, but like, let's not go there. You know, we don't want that version of technology. And instead, we really need to make sure we are really in dialogue with community. We understand what those needs are so that the technology, whether it's actual tech, whether it is processes, whether it's policy, is in service to those needs and those people, and not how the tool works, or the, you know, we have to make this decision because the technology needs us to fit into these 3 pre-programmed boxes. We don't need those boxes, right? We really need technology to be in service to us.
Thank you so much for sharing your screen as well as your insights into those images. I will say personally, it reminded me of these frescoes from Ambrogio Lorenzetti, centuries old. I am throwing the Wikipedia page for them in the chat, but they're called the Allegory of Good and Bad Government. And so very much in that kind of these two sides and where will we land. And with that kind of that idea of government in this current state and potential future state, hopeful future state, your book articulates 5 fluid but very kind of important groups in this conversation: social impact organizations, technologists, funders and investors, policymakers, and communities. How would you imagine a federal agency leader and reader to see themselves in your book? Are they within these categories, across them, separate? Is the federal government a 6th group? Is it a microcosm of this landscape? Is it all of the above?
Yeah, well, I think the first in that series of questions is to how should people see themselves, into which group, into all groups, into some of the groups? I think the answer is yes. And so the grouping around policymakers, which really speaks about people who are involved in the policymaking process, from congressmen to leaders of federal agencies to staffers and more. That might seem like the appropriate group, and I imagine many folks on this call and in government would identify there. But I would also encourage them to then think about which of the other groups they might also identify with. So perhaps because of their role, they can also identify as a technologist. We define technologists somewhat broadly in the book, so it's not just people who are PhDs in computer science who are designing everything, but if you've sort of inherited a somewhat technical portfolio in your office as someone who has been in that position and has put others, honestly speaking, in that position as well in government agencies, that might be you. As also, I think, important to recognize that sometimes the federal government is a funding entity in the way that it administers grants. And so recognizing that you could also be part of that funders and investors category as well. And then certainly the federal government in different agencies, different departments, different offices can function like a social impact organization in how they need to think and operate, how they create their strategies, how they need to imagine using technology to help execute on their mission. And I think ultimately, back to the image that we have that's about people and communities, we're all part of different communities. So recognizing what communities you're a part of, recognizing which communities you're a part of that have power, that don't have as much power, and what you can do to help equalize and to shift that power, I think is important. So I've now, I guess, shifted shifted from my one word answer that was easier to there are probably elements of each role that are in the day jobs that you have. And that is by design, recognizing that we hold different roles and responsibilities at different times.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing about, that image that the colorful future state or what is needed in our world that requires binary thinking. Like you are not or are one of those roles. What is the moment of the day when you are a community member? What is the moment of the day when you are a policymaker? And giving yourself the freedom to accept the reality that you are going through all of those different roles, depending on the meeting, depending on the conversation, depending on what the goal is. And I think it allows us to get out of, well, that's not my job over there. Every single one of us, it is our job to be getting us to this world, right? To ask questions and to advocate however we can from whatever seat we're in, whatever context we're in. And I think that's why we didn't write a book just for nonprofits and just for policymakers, right? Because on any given day, we might have 3 different opportunities to be in 3 different roles, and having one vision across all of that gets us to that equitable world, we hope, means we can actually get there faster because we're all kind of operating with that same kind of lens instead of feeling like there's only one spot to be.
And I just want to build on what Amy said, because something they said just really stuck out to me, which is, what role are you, in what moment of the day are you holding which role? And I think, Amy, I loved when you said that, because it just reinforced to me the fact that we don't just have roles from 8 to 5 or whatever your working hours might be, right? You are complete people who exist as humans 24/7, not just in particular roles. And even some of the policies that you create or some of the work that you're doing has an effect on you, has an effect on your friends, on your families, on your broader communities and neighborhoods all of the time. And so recognizing that there's a role at all times for us.
I think that's an incredibly poignant sentiment, definitely one that I will be taking with myself outside of the work hours of my 5 p.m. Eastern time. One thing I think, though, that we can say is that regardless of our roles or the code switching that we're doing between meetings and at any given moment, we're all learners, right? And with that, it's, learning through conversation, but also something that I really appreciate and that the partnership wholeheartedly endorses is the book's imperative and importance placed on providing training for all persons, regardless of their role, on the text selection and use, on the impacts of it, on the importance of gathering feedback. What do you think training could look like for federal government employees to be able to equip them in order to harness their role towards this future state?
Yeah, great question. I have a few thoughts and I will keep them short. I think the first part is, before we talk about training, every single role, that job description needs to be able to say what technology decisions, what technology tools, what technology use or skills they might need, not as a prerequisite to apply, but once you are on board. Because if there's nothing written down that says you're making this tech decision, but also it's not written anywhere that anyone's making that tech decision, who's making the decision, right? Humans don't do well operating on assumption. So let's cut the assumption out and make sure that technology is articulated in every single job. And then from there, it's much easier to budget and plan and say, wow, we have 8 staff who all have this level of data management in their job. We better be making sure that we have budget for 8 people to be getting that data training, right? Not just the one default person whose title is IT manager or something, right? So it gives you a great planning tool from there. I've also seen, we really value in the book and speak to what self-determination means for each of us as people and to an equitable future. But for training, this is very true. And we see this at NTEN all the time. a pre-selected, everyone must do this training is almost always around a product, because it's a product the organization or the entity or the agency already uses. And so it's something like, hey, we all use this, there's an update, here's the training. But the most transformative trainings for staff are ones that they have selected based on the own place in their personal learning and professional development journey, as well as what they know are the places where they kind of rub up against something they don't know how to do in their day-to-day job. And being able to let them choose a training based on those actual places where they're kind of hitting a wall or they're rubbing against something will really unlock a lot for them and can lead to better retention. People are getting support where they need it most versus where it's told to them. And I think that can be a really powerful tool for having folks feel empowered in their roles.
And I'd say, just from a leadership perspective, really emphasizing in your communications, in your interactions, the importance of people being familiar with the technology systems that are used and that are rely on being familiar with outputs and how the different technology systems might be driving decision making, whether it's looking at a dashboard or helping to process interactions with the community or whoever else, but really from a leadership perspective, making sure that the communications do reinforce the importance of people being up to speed on the technology and how then it then is adopted into the functions of the organization and really helps support executing against the mission.
I think that point of communication and transparency for all the individuals within an agency is incredibly important. Looking to kind of external reporting, what agencies want to broadcast to the public that they serve. You put forth in the book the proposal that social impact organizations, which I believe also extends to agencies, should be regularly talking about how technology changes impact their program outcomes and vice versa. So when it comes to what government can share with the public, are there specific things that you would like to see in government, government talking about more? Is it just the, cost savings that they're getting? Is it the dollars that they're spending on specific technology, or is it something, altogether very different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot that government can share, and I hope government, continues to increase the efforts of the past decade or so to be a bit more transparent in the operations and the cost spending and sharing of the activities of government. I think also what's important is for government to share, in addition to some of these operational metrics that people want to know, or some of these overall economy metrics and job metrics and others that are common and that we hear all of the media and press about. And I think we've got another report coming out soon, for example. But I think for me, it's also important for government to talk about how they've been working with citizens, how they've been working with the people that they serve, how they've been working with the community, essentially. So what that looks like, thinking about how to communicate how engagement has looked like, how to communicate what ownership has looked like, how to communicate what equity has looked like, and what any impacts that have varied based on location, race, gender, or host of other demographics, what that looks like as well. So really continuing to share, in addition to some of these operational metrics, some of the impact metrics, and some of the back to people and communities, which is a very common theme in our book, what that has looked like for those government agencies. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. In communities that I work with and NTEN works with, often the first thing, if we were to ask, about technology and government, the place that kind of regular people go is data, and is not necessarily like tech investments or system investments. And so acknowledging that, and I think a nonprofit organization that's community-based, is small, is, deep in the work with community members, has often practices about sharing where this data is going to go. Can you update this data? Who will have access to this data? Why are we collecting it? What are we going to use? What decisions are we making from this? Those are often not questions you see answered on a government form that is asking you to share all the same data that nonprofit asked for. But the nonprofit probably had a much better experience for the user, right? And created trust. And so opportunities to, even if you can't do it on behalf of your entire agency, but you can do it for a specific program or even for a specific meeting, any place that you have power to do it, saying, this is where this information is going to go. This is the decision we're going to make from this. Those places really build trust with community. And I think that's really, really necessary to find even small places where you can kind of hook that trust in, because the more you do that, again, the more you create accountability. People can say, but I was in that meeting and we said this, and you said, you were going to make this decision from it, and this doesn't make sense, right? I know no human likes a lot of conflict and wants to be, accountable in that way, but it is going to make us better. It's going to build accountability so that we can build something together. And ultimately, community saying, hey, there needs to be some accountability here. This isn't what we thought, is good. That means they're paying attention. They are engaged. They want the policy to be as good as it can be, right? When no one's paying attention, that's when we have a problem, not when we have conflict. Conflict is fine. It's when no one is there to have the conflict or to say, hey, where is this data going? What is happening with this? So I would say welcome it to the degree that is healthy, but find those places where you can answer questions that are otherwise not being answered for communities.
Yeah, I think sitting in conflict and discomfort is something that I would definitely incorporate into any training that I am a participant of or an administrator for. I think, Amy, your points on data really draw my attention to two examples in the book. One, WHO data and their work in New Orleans, and the Los Angeles COVID-19 dashboard. I don't know if you want to speak to either of those, of kind of a way of presenting data and making sure that there's engagement throughout the process and that that data is accessible for anyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think starting with the WHO data example in New Orleans is a very community-driven project, and started by Dr. Michelle Thompson, who's a professor at the University of New Orleans, I think. I started to say that and then thought halfway through that I'm not. Anyway, she's a professor in New Orleans, and had really had a passion for how can communities understand that the data that they have, how can they really think about what mapping looks like and mapping the wealth and opportunity and access within communities. And so ran and continues to run a really intentional process of working in communities with local students that are there, working with people who are living in the communities, many of whom who have been there for years, if not decades or more, to really make sure people understand what is going on and how that then can tie to things like looking at home ownership abilities, looking at the ability to secure loans for whatever purposes people want, to the ability to secure jobs and education that people want. And so really it's a very community-centered partnership model that's done and very intentional there. The COVID modeling in LA County example is similar in that it is similar in that it is using local data, but is a bit different. And that was driven very much from LA County itself and from government employees, and an interesting model of both government employees and a volunteer, someone who volunteered their time to help with this mapping. And so that was done so that people could have access to the government information, but then really spend time thinking about what's the translation, how is this information going to be translated in ways that the community can actually understand what's going on and what COVID numbers are actually looking like and what the impact of the COVID pandemic looks like, how frequently that information needs to be updated, where that information needs to live, thinking about if other people need to be involved in then actually communicating that message to specific community members or communities in general, and thinking through that. So I think that example is more of one that's driven more from the government side, and the WHO data is more a strictly community-based side. But the commonality there is really focusing on what do the communities need to hear, and who do they need to hear it from, and what information do they actually want in order to make decisions for themselves.
Yeah, it was just kind of, it reminded me of a story that's not in the book, but in 2008, 9, etc. I was living and working in the UK, and that was around the time, if folks, go back in time in your mind palace to that era, that's when, government providing open data sets was like really becoming a thing. And, the big argument of that time is like, is it really open data if it's provided inaccessibly? Yes, you offered a download in a file type that 4 people can open, does that count as open data? And I was working with a number of councils around London and south of London who were saying, well, we'll jump on that bandwagon. Let's open up our data. We'll provide the download. And we offered them what was perceived as a very radical response. I think everyone here with time on our side will know was not radical, which was people don't know what you have. So we need to go ask them first what they want, right? They might not want all of your data actually, or they might want it in a very specific way. Maybe they don't even need to be able to download it if you could just give them the chart, right? So just to kind of underpin Afua's point, we started holding these kind of facilitated half-day events with different community organizations, with actual community members, all these different folks. And what turned out was folks had very specific questions that had very specific answers. No one was asking for the council to just make an Excel download of the whole council database, right? They wanted to know, what's the air quality around these schools? Not what's all of the air quality for all of London and all of time. They wanted, what's the air quality around the schools, right? So just engaging folks, I think, can also get us to better data, because we don't need to collect everything on everyone at every time when we have specific practical questions we're trying to answer, so that we can then know where we might need policy, where we might need to make changes, where we need to make investments. And those questions are really helpful, again, framed from the community versus our maybe assumptions of what's a priority.
I think there are so many great points to take from that. But I'm really catching myself on that specific questions and specific answers piece. And you talk about the limitations of data when it's not presented in a format that is accessible to people. But I'll ask, maybe inhabiting the mind of that data analyst at a federal agency that's several degrees removed from the front lines, from the communities that their programs and their services impact. They know that they have imperfect, incomplete data. What advice or guidance do you have from them other than to just like keep pushing forward?
This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I think there's this myth that comes from a lot of places, and none of those places are ours that we need to maintain. We can let go of them. But there's this myth that, like, if we could just all agree that this is the definition of high school graduation rate, that this is the definition of resident, that this is the definition of insert many things from the news recently, right? There is no definitive definition. We will never get there. We could get to a place where 5 agencies could agree. Those agencies are not the communities that are influenced or impacted or data is being reported into, right? What does it look like, instead of trying to say, we need to get to this place where everyone's database has all the same definitions and the same answer options and whatever? What if we say, we accept the self-determination, we accept the nuance, we accept that this data set is going to be equally as diversely defined as this data set, and that allows us to compare the data, right? Versus saying we have to get to a point where every single thing is exactly the same, because that's a direction we can't go. So instead of just fighting against it when we know we can't go that route, how do we turn around and embrace the alternative, that it is going to be diverse, it's going to be nuanced, that data set is never going to be perfect. Perfect doesn't exist. And so instead, how do we say, hey, this data set that includes race demographics, there were organizations who were reporting in data and profiles from users were self-defined, included self-defined races, also included 18 different, preset options. There's a lot in there. There's so many different things, right? And that's okay. We accept how diverse this data set is because it still allows us to say, hey, there were a lot of different people with a different races in this study or something, right? Same with gender, same with whatever. But I do think our brains, while it's not as easy to program for in a database, our brains can accept that level of diversity and that there is nuance within that we can hold on to and still move forward in our decisions. Afua, what were you going to say? I saw you, you were like, yes, and I'm...
No, excuse me. No, we're, as you said, Amy, we could talk about this topic for a long time. And so I think just building on some of the things you said, Amy, you mentioned that things won't be perfect. And so I think that is an acknowledgement that we have to make is even, despite what some tech marketing firms will tell you, technology cannot make things perfect for you, cannot make things perfect for us. Technology cannot perfectly solve every problem and every situation that we might imagine or might be the reality. And so I think that's just something to note. I think also then, that leads to the fact that continuously trying to improve data sets and to expand data sets, to make data sets more inclusive, to make data sets more representative, to make data sets more accurate is an ongoing process. It is rarely a one and done. And if you do it, start it today, you'll be able to finish it tomorrow and you never have to touch it again. That is not a timeline that I have ever seen in any of the organizations I've worked with in any sector, and not one I would expect to ever see. So I think just recognizing that it's an ongoing process. I would say, though, related to that, the education for people who are doing this, your question, Emma, for people who are far removed, sort of organizationally from the actual communities that data reflects, although they may be removed organizationally or process-wise, that doesn't prevent people from doing some research and really understanding the context in which they are operating, sort of what underlying laws have created and led to the need and existence of their agency and of their department and of their specific team and that specific project that they're working on, what types of effects and good and bad those policies have had that have led to why are we collecting this data? Why are we looking at this data? Why are we doing this work? I think understanding that context is incredibly important. And then I think the last point that I would encourage people to think about is just, again, back to the human and the human component of things, is that technology is helping, and back to technology isn't magically fixing everything. Recognizing that your role as the human there is really important, because as far as technology can go, we still need humans to make those final determinations, to make that final translation from what the technology can do with all of its strengths, what it can do, and to actual reality and what can be implemented and sustained and maintained. And that human piece is really important. So recognizing sort of the power that people have in that place and understanding how to shepherd it.
Yeah, and I think not only do you have the power to expand your data sets, but there are processes in place for federal agencies to invite more of that qualitative input that can never be wholly represented in a spreadsheet in the most sophisticated of databases, whether built in-house or from a vendor. Something that I'm thinking about is, I think that there are some immediate actions that government agencies can take to invite more of that qualitative input, regardless of where their physical station is. Extending public comment periods, making user research, and more importantly, user compensation for participation in research the standard. These are some of these kind of incremental and immediate things. But you also want to balance that with this kind of long-term game of eliminating like these inequitable structures, processes, the laws that lead to these situations. So if you have either, anything to add to those immediate incremental change, but then how are you thinking about this much harder question of what we see in the long game?
Yeah, I think to your point, it is a long game, but there are steps we can take today. So do want to acknowledge, I think, just some of the efforts of the current administration to intentionally say equity matters and equity in data matters, and actually having a number of data councils that are like data equity councils on a number of different topics and policies. I think that to me is a huge step forward. It is 2022. I am glad that we have recognized that equity in data is a thing, and a thing that we should care about at the federal level. And so I'll just want to acknowledge that and recognize that and say that we can be looking for more ways to do this and more ways to do it at different scales. So maybe not just at the top level agencies and with top level people, but making sure what does that look like for our smaller systems and things like that. So I'd really encourage people to think really intentionally about what equity looks like. And then to one of the points that we were talking about before about the accessibility and just accessibility and any information that the government is sharing. Amy and I start our book off by going through a number of values and recognizing just that we are always building on top of values that we have, whether or not we explicitly say them. It's kind of clear when you look back at what's been created, what some of your values were. And so let's be intentional. And so some of those values we talk about, though, are accessibility. And that is accessibility to decision-making processes, to time, to how people are getting information and everything that is. So thinking about accessibility really broadly, thinking about really valuing different types of expertise and lived experience as well, and being really inclusive in who is creating sort of a big picture vision and who is actually at the decision-making tables on a day-to-day basis. So I encourage people to really think about those values as well.
Yeah, I also want to add, I agree with all of that, and would add that it doesn't matter what agency you are in or what, state, regional, federal, it does not matter who you are. In your work, technology is necessary. The internet is necessary for you to be on this call, for you to do your work every day. So you have all of the talking points you need to say that technology is necessary for your agency to be investing in for community members. Every time there's an announcement about like a new cool way to navigate national parks, maps online, or here's information about public comment periods, and anywhere in between those examples, it assumes every single person is online and able to interact with that. And I think instead of saying like, well, that's the FCC, and saying, hey, we all are interfacing with the internet, and in theory, at least, have community members, have individual people who are interfacing with us through the internet, but not everyone can. And so the more diverse the call to invest in digital equity is, I think the faster we will get more and better investment, because it isn't just about from a FCC perspective of making sure there's policy that says everyone should access, et cetera. We do need that. And we need a state level, wildlife agency saying, hey, people can't report to us from the field if they don't have internet service in that part of our state, right? Like the more diverse the reasons that we can articulate, the better we can get that buy-in and movement so that everyone really can be with us in an online world.
And I think that really reminds me of some of the work that you briefly touch on in the book by the US Digital Service, and how they not only go to agencies to support their tech, but also often with the choice not to use technology and to look instead at process redesign, at how they're engaging and building community in order to inform their work. Something that I will seize upon when we're talking about the access to the internet, broadband. Many, individuals call this kind of like internet as the new human right, And so you note in the book how laws, policies, regulations, all of these things in tandem will either accelerate or hinder efforts to realize this future state of equitable tech for all. So how do you kind of balance what we would say is an ethics-based framework, which is something that, you know, social impact organizations, committed companies, and funders can kind of agree upon and make the norm, versus more of a human rights-based framework that's legal, that's codified, that has accountability measures in place?
I think with ethics, you are putting forward something that says there, even if it is complex, there is a spectrum of good to bad, and that something is getting, you know, more troublesome as it goes down that spectrum, and it is getting to a like kind of purer, better place when it goes up the scale towards good. And when you are leaving ethics out, I don't know that we even use the word ethics in the book, you know, but when we're talking about equity, equity is not fair, equity is not equal, equity does not need those things, right? Equity is saying, what do you, Emma, need, right? Afua, what do you need? It doesn't matter if your list of top 10 tools to take into the new world even overlap, right? They could be completely separate set of tools. And equity says, I see your list and I will give it to you, right? Versus ethics is saying, well, everyone should have these. And I think that's a place that is, again, hard because it's complex and it requires us to say, there's not a perfect list. There's not a perfect answer. And so how do we build systems from that perspective? And I think part of it starts with, how do we build up trust that people would tell us truly what their answers are and not be worried that they will experience further harm by disclosing they need something that is really basic or is really hard, right? Or is hard to deliver, but it is really what they need. And I think from a human rights perspective, you know, as an organization that's been advocating towards broadband as a human right, what we see is, yes, that doesn't mean it's going to be delivered to everyone, right? Most humans have agreed water is a pretty basic human right. Y'all, we have a whole lot of tribal lands without access to clean water. We have entire cities without access to clean water. So what we're trying to say is, can this be accepted as something that's necessary to hold other providers accountable to deliver, versus saying, oh, once we write it down that it's a human right, like we'll all get it. We know that it's not that easy, but it gives you a place to build accountability from and to advocate from. When it's not even accepted as a human right, you don't have a lot of place to advocate from.
Yeah, +1 to everything Amy said. There is no perfect list. There's, right, if we could have built a checklist to say, do these 10 things, and now the world is equitable, we would have just given you a checklist as opposed to writing an entire book. But we didn't, because we can't. And so I think that's just a point. And Emma, to your question, you mentioned accountability. I think that is what's really important when we think about what rights are. We, you know, quoted a couple of human rights technologists in the book for that reason, because really thinking about what are the principles that need to be there, what does the advocacy then need to look like? What does justice actually mean? What does it really mean to implement equity? I think is a really good question for us as we think about access to the internet, as we think about use of technology tools in general as well. So really thinking about what are the accountability systems that government builds for itself, that communities build for themselves, that we hold funders and investors to, that social impact organizations look at, that we hold and ask and demand of technologists who are building these systems that affect people. What do those accountability structures look like throughout, and how are we continuing to push on that? How are we continuing to recognize these conversations around equity and technology are really about justice and about human rights?
As you know, a human rights major with a master's degree in it, this is just music absolutely to my ears. In thinking about that idea of the quote unquote perfect list that we know doesn't exist, it's, you know, this asymptotic thing that we're always going to be chasing, right? But, you know, we're still trying to. like I see this tension at the partnership and with like-minded organizations and individuals that we interact with, where we want to draw attention to cybersecurity and to the mundane, the boring but basic systems, as you call them, of like accounting and customer relationship management, but also thinking about these pressing and press generating issues around tech, the ethical application of AI, the extension of broadband to all. How do you combat kind of the overwhelm or perhaps the apathy that one can face when you are a policymaker or a policy informer, which we are all capable of being?
Yeah, so I think a couple of ways. And so one, just as you mentioned, sort of the boring technologies. There's no boring technology here. The work of making sure institutions function is incredibly important, and I would argue exciting. I may be in the minority there, but it is exciting and it is important work to make sure that the institutions that we have charged with and look to for providing critical resources and services are equipped to deliver those with a lot of different resources, including access to technology. That said, for the broader question, though, that you asked as I step off of my soapbox a little bit, I think it's important to recognize that, yes, there are a lot of issues. There are a lot of technical issues to look at, to deal with. There are a lot of issues broadly in the world. And just because there's nearly an infinite number of issues doesn't mean you necessarily need to be an expert in every single one of those issues. You can identify the areas where you can be an expert, and you can identify experts in other areas, and then you can work together. And so I think that was one of the key things we wanted to communicate in the book, that it really does take all of us working together in order to build this more equitable world that we want. And so really thinking through what are some immediate steps that you can do in sort of your control today, and identify those. And then maybe there are other conversations that you can start to participate in, that you can start to contribute to, and you can move those discussions forward and move those actions forward as well. But you don't need to be, and I would argue that we don't need single individual heroes to redo everything in society by themselves. I think we have some narratives that have been created like that, and they're mostly, well, completely detrimental. But recognizing that it does take all of us, that there is, though, also something you can probably do within your span of control and moving that forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think about policy making for and about technology a lot like technology itself. No one necessarily sets out to say, well, I'm already the expert on this, and so now I have created this perfect tool, right? Instead, they're saying, I really want to build something that does X or gets at a certain goal, and let's start building it. And policy making around technology, you don't need to be the expert already in the end. You need to be the expert in the process. What is the best way to build policy? Just like, successful tech companies know the best way to build towards technology. They are great at the process. They know, when to bring in the designer, how to do testing, all of those different pieces. It's the same. You don't need to know the ins and outs of how some piece of code works to advocate for privacy, to advocate for self-determination in data, to advocate that your community members have access to the tools that they need. And you already know how to do that. Advocate for that, and then be an expert in great process, including community members in every single stage, making sure that you're building education within your community to help you advocate, right? If they don't already necessarily have the skills or knowledge to navigate those systems. Really focus on the process, and then it doesn't matter what policy you're building for, right? Whether it's about technology or not, if you really become great at that process of including folks, you will build great policy no matter what the topic is. But please make it about technology. We need more good policy.
I hear that. +1 to all of that. I think when you're talking about being an expert in process, and then, having that kind of lead the way and lead policy, it reminds me of an example in your book around the Farm Bill, and was hoping that you can kind of for our attendees. Just talk a little bit about that process and what made it so exemplary of the way in which policy can be made.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, in our policymakers chapter, we talk about this example of the Farm Bill and working with a particular community organization, the Rural Center for, okay, sorry, acronyms are hard for me today. RCAP is the acronym. Someone can look it up as to what it is. But the work started with RCAP and doing some just really actually USDS-like work with this nonprofit organization. And after seeing some of the successes of this organization that, thank you, Rural Community Assistance Partnership, so after seeing some of the successes here, and RCAP is set up to work with many sort of subsidiary organizations, the RCAP leadership thought, well, I wonder if there's a way we can get people together to do some of this similar type of activity, to then think about what some new policies we might want are created, or what new programs might be helpful. And so then, working in partnership with a couple of other organizations, invited a number of people to get together in a room all day to then talk about these ideas. And so you had in this room people from RCAP, you had in this room some people who had been policymakers, you had in the room people who were farmers, you had in the room people who were technologists. And so people from all different backgrounds, from all of those different roles that we've identified in the same room, talking about what are the issues that you're seeing from your viewpoint. How do we now have a conversation about what different parties could bring together, or what different parties might want to bring together to create something new. And so from those conversations that day, using some somewhat structured design thinking and other design and idea generating frameworks, left the day with a number of ideas about programs that could work or could not work, or even just ideas of how people might be able to work together and what support people needed. Excuse me. Then as a small subset of the group was sort of identified as the leaders to take this cause forward. And so then went and reviewed the ideas, determined what the sort of highest priority were, and then started working directly with policymakers, started having conversations with staffers. And so this process that we've talked about policymakers being really intentional about seeking community input and listening, the policymakers in this case did that and worked with these community members, these representatives of the social impact organizations and the communities, to hear what they had to say. And fast forward several months, if not a year or so, and in the Farm Bill, there's actually this Farm Bill of 2016, maybe, a Farm Bill of a prior year. There was a new program created that actually came out of that initial brainstorming that RCAP had pulled together with a number of organizations. And so, again, I think the things to highlight are, first, starting by bringing people of the different backgrounds together. Everyone has a role. You don't have to be a technologist. You don't have to be a farmer. You could be whatever, and you've got a role to play, pulling everyone together. And then that really intentional engagement with the policymaking process and policymakers seeking out input and reacting, and then working to actually create some new policies, create a new program in this case, because, for a lot of systemic change that we want, policymaking is one of our strongest tools. And so we were able to go through the whole process there.
I think something to build off of that for folks on the call, even if you are yourself not a policymaker, you're calling in from an agency that isn't part of Congress and trying to direct policy, there's so much value that could come from investing in kind of emergent spaces. So building up relationships where maybe once a month there's this group of community members that you meet with, and there's not an agenda that you're setting. There's not, hey, we're already planning to change the website XYZ, or we're going to be building this tool. What do you want from it? It is just sitting at the table. It is listening to what's going on in their work, in their part of the state, in their part of the country, whatever it might be, and having those conversations. We've seen agencies and organizations who do that are able to say, oh, it came up 3 meetings in a row. People kept talking about this, and I realized we have the data for that. What if we worked together and we built this, tool, or we created an export and they were able to see the data? you would have never thought that that was something you needed to work on, or that that was a project to even propose, without having those open spaces just for conversation and connection to hear and learn together, where you saw a problem that maybe wasn't even articulated as a problem to solve and knew how to support it. So I think whoever you are, whatever agency you're working in or wherever you're going, that can be a really great way to just start investing an hour of your time once a month and having these open-ended conversations, because I think you could end up creating really, really great innovations from there.
That is the greatest call to action, if I've ever heard one, coming out of a webinar. I do want to thank you both so much, but before we kind of formally close, want to end with a question that really starts from the introduction to your book. You advise us to let go of the language that doesn't serve us in this work. And so would like to ask from you, perhaps maybe not what is the language that we should just scrub from our vocabulary, but instead, what is the language that we should be socializing more in the way that we've seen, recent executive orders and recent policies bring to the forefront language around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? What's more of the language that we should be seeing, and perhaps some of the concepts that we should be letting go of?
I don't know. Let's try. I'm committed for the long term. That is language I would like to hear. I think when we're operating from a place of not ever wanting to admit that we don't know, I mean, where do you go from there? You obviously don't know. When we're building something for the very first time, you cannot know how it's going to go. Stop saying that you do, right? And it's not about being humble so that it looks good in the end. It is being truthful. We do not know. We don't know what well, that's not true. Lots of people did see the pandemic coming. We just were not those people, and we weren't talking to them. But my point is, we don't know the future. The future is being created in every moment. And so say you don't know, and let's try it, and let's figure it out together, and that you are here, right? You're not going to leave the room angry. You're going to stay until we work through this. Let's go. And I think having that attitude, again, no matter who you are in whatever agency, at whatever, regional or federal level, saying, I don't know, and you don't know, and none of us know. So let's figure it out together, is such a more fruitful place to build from than, oh yeah, we already know, that's good, that's bad, right? Where do you go from there? You don't really have a lot of options.
And I think for me, so first, yes, to everything Amy just said, absolutely, let go of all of that. But I think for me, it really just boils down to, we can make change, and we can make a difference. I think that it is tempting. It is common to hear, especially in federal government spaces, when someone has a new idea, all of the reasons why it won't work, all of the reasons why you might have a lot of meetings and then it will be killed in the end, all of the reasons why it has failed in the past, all of the reasons why you might really care in that room that day, but there's no way management will ever care, or all of the reasons you might care in that room that day, but there's no reason the staff is ever going to care or be able to execute it, or that you won't find the funding for it, or that you won't have the time for it. And so I think the language that I want people to adopt is, we can change this, and we can make a difference.
Thank you. Not only for joining us today, but for writing, I think, the greatest compendium of I don't know, but I care, which is the tech that comes next. For those interested in engaging with this more, I really implore you to purchase or acquire a copy of the book. It has, case studies galore, questions that I will continue to ask myself and of others going forward. So thank you so much to those who joined, to those who will be watching this later. Thank you to Afua and Amy so much for everything that you do and have done and will continue to do in this space. We hope that you take something away from this conversation, and that you are inspired to join our next Author Talks conversation on August 17th with Marina Nitsa and Nick Sinai, who are penning the upcoming book, Hack Your Bureaucracy. Thank you so much. Again, to Afua and Amy and to everyone, I wish you a great day as we all work to build the tech that comes next.